Mary Louise, Mark Blaney. So just to make sure, what we try and do to open up the conversation here is just make sure that you're connecting with us. So we like to put something into the chat. We usually ask, how's the weather with you? But today we thought we'd actually try and ask a different type of question. And what we were wondering is whether we should have a theme tune for these webinars, yeah? So Jay, John, Catherine, what type of theme tune do you think we should have? Should it be something like Match of the Day theme tune, or should it be Terry and June, or
kind of news night, sort of BBC News, kind of serious? Oh, Euro football, I like that. That's good, especially if England win the tournament. I think that would be a nice hark back, wouldn't it? Don't Stop Me Now. Oh, fantastic.
Oh, the A-Team.
That's a good one. I like that.
Yeah. Or the Rocky theme music. That would be quite energizing, wouldn't it, for a Thursday?
Oh, Shadows Apache. That's good, Carl. Yeah, I like that. Magic Roundabout.
Magic Roundabout. That's probably more my level, to be honest.
Which of us is going to be Dougal? And
I love Benny Hill, Emma. Thank you. Hannah, The Long Run, The Eagles. That's a great song.
Got some Steve. Pure comedy gold here, haven't we?
Mission Impossible. I totally agree with you.
We're going to have to save this chat and see what we can do with it at the next one.
Definitely.
When we come back in September, we can come back all guns blazing.
So we've kind of gone 2 minutes into it. Now we can start guessing everyone's age exactly. So we've gone 2 minutes into the presentation just to make sure everybody's on board. So I'm happy to start. Helen, Dan, you okay to go?
Yeah, go for it.
Good. So today's topic is, what does a good enough strategy look like? And it's really interesting that 2008, when the recession hit, and charities started to look at what they were going to do and how they were going to respond, they turned to their strategy. And exactly the same thing is happening now. I'm seeing a huge number of charities focusing back on their strategy and saying, have we got it right or have we got it wrong? Well, actually, you need to do it pretty quickly, because at the moment, it's about tactics. Yeah, it's about deploying your, if you like, resources in the right way to keep moving forward. And the strategy, the big, if you like, sort of end goal should be pretty solid. Yeah. So we thought we'd run a session on what does a good enough strategy look like, just to help you think. Yeah. So Dan, next slide, please. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about what's a strategy. We're going to give a structure, a one-page strategy, talk about issues and implications, and then we'll just go normally into open questions. Anybody can ask anything. We'll open the mics and we'll just have a bit of a discussion. So next slide, please, Dan. Just a little bit about Moore Kingston Smith, 64 partners, focused on charities. Sorry, 64 partners, 14 focused on charities. And we have over 750 charity clients. So our stretch is wide. Next slide. And here's the perfectly formed team in terms of, it's no longer called fundraising and management, it's now called nonprofit advisory services, but we do impact, we do fundraising, and we do good financial management, and that all comes together in strategy. And then the final little prompt before we get into the meat of the day, we've got two things coming up. 15th of July, we've got a strategy morning, and that's proper training. So it's please come along and join us. And then we've got a podcast. We're going to try something new. We're going to try a podcast, and we might even play a little bit of Terry and June to kick that off, or something like that, or the Euro football, or the A-Team, whatever our theme tune is going to be. So that's it. So let's get into the meat of today, and let's talk about, first of all, what is strategy. So Dan, if you can go to the next slide. I mean, strategy is the Greek art of war. So strategos literally means army general. In other words, an army general who leads and takes people into battle to go and win a war. Yeah. And what they do in terms of the strategy is they deploy tactics. And tactics are the resources and the methods and the means of actually achieving the win, in the battle. And that's what strategy is. Strategy is the big picture. Strategy is what you're trying to achieve. It's a major aim, yeah? And the tactics are the small things that we do to move us to get towards the end goal. Now, I've worked with lots of strategists, And it's really interesting. I've only ever worked with 2 real strategists, and both of them have had this ability to take 2 and 2 and make 5. And, logic and just rearranging the pieces that you've got and the resources that you've got will get you so far. But sometimes you just need imagination to dream up something different. You need that blue sky moment, yeah? And so logic will get you from A to B, imagination will take you everywhere. So actually strategy goes from actually pretty mundane, just little tweaks through to actually we might need to profoundly change the way we do things, yeah? And get some blue sky thinking in there. Next slide, Dan. So within Moore Kingston Smith, we're getting a lot of charities come to us. And I'd say that 50% are worried about survival and 50% are worried about reimagining themselves for the future. In other words, they're stable, but they realize they're going to have to change. And it might be because of COVID. It might be because they've got to put in IT, for example, to meet their beneficiaries' needs and their service users' needs. They're going to have to change. And you can see here Handy's Second Curve. It's a brilliant book, called The Second Curve. And it starts here with a maturity curve. You incept, you grow, and then you come to this bit, this decline curve where it drops off. Well, the real art is noticing when that is, and then reinventing before that decline curve. In other words, before you reach maturity. And the really smart organizations do that, yeah? So they're always looking out for this thing called generative and the change. The Charity Commission CC3, I think it is, says trustees have to be strategic, they have to be focused on their fiduciary duties, but then also they've got to be focused on new ideas and this generative way of thinking. So this curve and when to reinvent is incredibly important. Next slide, if you may, Dan. And I think COVID-19 gives us a perfect opportunity to think about how we're going to change. Jim Collins, management guru who did Great to Good and other books, has said, look, if you don't have a strategy now for how you're going to leverage and use COVID-19, to help do more and to help your beneficiaries and also to create change in the world, then you're really missing a trick. In other words, he's not seeing it as negative at all. He's seeing it as playing right into the change we need to make, for strategy and for our futures. Next slide. By the way, anybody ever got any comments, just throw them into the chat functions because it makes it far more interesting, and then I can bounce backwards and forwards with people in the chat. So what I learned from those 2 really good strategists out of like literally the lots that I've worked with is simply this. They see strategy as a simple process. Where are we now? Where do we want to get to, and how are we going to do that? Yeah, I'm just going to go through that again. Where are we now? Where are we trying to get to, and how are we going to do that? And those are the 3 things we're going to articulate in a strategy. And it can be very prescriptive, or it can be very loose. So let's have a look at a prescriptive set of questions. So of course, we're going to ask smart questions. Yeah, smart questions are the key to unlocking a good strategy. And so I've mapped out some here, which I developed at Cass Business School just to help people to think. Yeah, and so sustainability. How can we become more sustainable? Now, there's 15 different definitions of sustainability. One of those is finance. So how can we become more sustainable to ensure that we continue to meet beneficiaries' needs? And how do we balance beneficiaries' need now and in the future? That's a great question. Yeah, that's a strategic question. Impact. Yeah, Martin, the presentation will be circulated. Impact. How can we focus better on impact? How can we better meet beneficiaries' needs? How can we balance funding with our impact? How can we get this head and heart, this money and impact piece right? The bit we never talk about, but a lot of startups talk about is efficiency. How do we maximize the outcomes for the resource levels we have, for the amount of money we spend, let's say, or the volunteers we have? How do we maximize the change we create? How do we invest for the future? How do we develop an investment mindset? And I think a lot of charities are starting to realize they've got to invest now after COVID, in other words, the post-COVID world, and they're going to have to develop an investment mindset to do that. In other words, you invest to make that change, to make that curve happen in the future. Reimagination, how do we reimagine our products and services to increase the impact for beneficiaries? How do we take an advantage of shift, for example, in government funding or digital disruption, specifically with COVID? But you can't do that without changing people. And how do you take people on this journey, this change journey? How do you embed long-lasting change? And how can you use your volunteers, for example, better to help? So those are prescriptive questions. And you can see they're very formulaic, but you go down through a way. And this is very much what a strategy process sometimes can look like. In other words, it can be very linear. Let's try a different approach. So what I've done is I've put up a picture here. Now, it's fairly abstract. You can't really see where it is, yeah? And yet we all know it's London. You can see Tower Bridge, you can see St. Paul's Cathedral, you can see the Gherkin in the middle there, and the buildings, the walkie-talkie. It's a loose picture, yeah? And sometimes strategy, it's good enough just to put this loose, broad canvas up there and to say to people, is that enough of a picture? Do you think you can work towards that? And the Japanese school, of strategy would say you accentuate the positives and you remove the barriers. And that enables you to move towards the strategy, but it's kind of ill-defined, and everybody can find their, if you like, sort of image within that. It's not prescriptive. So I hope you've got an idea there that there's lots of different ways to do strategy. Reimagination, survival, it's all part of the mix, yeah? What Helen's going to do now is talk you through what we've chosen as, if you like, a strategic framework that might be helpful for you, yeah? So if I hand over to you, Helen.
Thanks, Mark. So yeah, we just wanted to kind of take people through what a kind of overall one-page strategy might look like. And there's a few kind of advantages of a one-page strategy. One sort of fairly obvious one is around kind of mission drift. And this is something which can happen with organizations if there's a very complex strategy with a kind of strategic framework that's multiple pages long and things like that. It can be hard to keep referring back to a strategy and to make sure that when you're having those kind of ongoing meetings and you're going through more of the kind of day-to-day processes, that you are kind of thinking at that strategic level as well as that more kind of tactical level. And having a kind of strategy on a single page document really helps to kind of keep it first and foremost in people's heads. So if we move on to the next slide, please, Dan. Here we go. This is the kind of overall picture of what the page might look like if you were to kind of put it all on one page. And we'll go through each of these sides of the kind of main square in a clockwise direction in a moment. But I just wanted to kind of pause here and explain really kind of where the frameworks come from. And some of you might notice, especially if you've got a bit of an impact measurement background, that there's quite a lot of kind of impact language in here. So we're talking about stakeholders, we're talking about outcomes and things like that. And actually, the one-page strategy is really kind of orientated around a kind of deconstructed theory of change. One of the reasons we kind of wanted to do that, and I'm sure if you've been to a number of our webinars, you'll kind of hear this theme arising again and again, that actually there's been research that's shown that it's impossible for one organization to simultaneously prioritize financial status and also impacts. So it's impossible to prioritize those both at the same time. Organizations have to make a decision. And you can see here that we very squarely decided we're going to put our strategy on a page. We're going to kind of go with this one-page strategy that has this big focus on impact, because at the end of the day, we're impact-driven organizations, and that's what kind of really needs to shape our thinking and shape our priorities. One of the other advantages as well, with kind of using all of these impact kind of language and things like that in this piece, is that actually when you do come to measuring your impacts and tracking your changes as you go along, you've almost already got those kind of ideas present. So you've got those outcomes, you've got those kind of stakeholder groups. So you're really ensuring that when you're tracking your kind of impact going forwards, that process will align very, very clearly with your strategic thinking, which is a fantastic advantage as well with using something that kind of looks along these lines. So if we go to the next slide, we're starting here on the left with the kind of the impact side of this square. And you can see that at the top we've got kind of one box where you would talk about your vision, your mission and your values. And then below that, you would kind of go into a little bit more detail about your actual strategic outcomes. So we want to kind of make sure that those are kind of quite distinct from each other, that we've got the vision and the mission and those quite high level, ambitious kind of blue sky kind of thinking there, but we also go into maybe something a little bit more specific and a little bit more detailed about your actual strategic outcomes, mapping out what you want to do and what is kind of achievable for your organization over the time scale that you're thinking about. I think that was all I was going to say on that side. So if we go to the next one, this is where we really take a look at the stakeholders of your organization. And the kind of impact measurement, this is my discipline, impact measurement. This is the direction that I'm coming from here. And the impact definition for stakeholders is anyone or any organization that changes as a result of your work. So you can see in that definition that we would really be kind of casting our net very widely here. So we would, of course, be thinking about what people may want to call primary beneficiaries or the kind of the service users, the clients who kind of really make use of your services. But we would also want to think about lots of other groups as well. We might want to think about their loved ones, maybe their siblings or their family members or friends they're associated with. We might want to think about funders, local commissioners, local businesses, partnerships. Are there any other charities that change as a result of what you do? If you're a campaigning organisation or if you have any kind of campaigning arms, do you work with MPs? Do you work with government departments and things like that? So we're really kind of casting out our net wide and making sure that we're including the kind of the broad definition of stakeholders and coming at it from a really kind of external view in this side of the square here. Of course, one of the crucial parts of this square as well is how you're going to meet their needs and work together. That's always what we would want to kind of focus on in this area. And then if we go on to the next slide, so here we have the actual activities, so how you're going to bring about these changes that we've talked about on the left hand side for these stakeholders on the top of the square. And in a kind of theory of change, you might see these referred to as outputs as well. And you can see that we have a few examples here. We've got a little bit of an example in the whole piece actually of a kind of hospice type organisation. So they might be delivering patient services, but it's also really important here that we include the other elements of our organisations as well. So we're explicitly talking about things like communications, things like marketing, because of course they play a very strong strategic role, and we want to be very explicit in including those kind of pieces of the organization onto this one-page strategy so that we can kind of consider that and monitor it going forwards. And then on the very bottom here, we have the kind of resources side of the square, or maybe the kind of inputs we might talk about. So what's actually going to be required to bring about this change? It might be money, what kind of time, what people and volunteers you can see. But another really important part of this side of the square is the barriers and the enablers. And one way that we can think about this is what's the biggest lever that you might want to pull in order to kind of to bring about this change going forwards. And it's also quite reminiscent of what Mark's just talked about with the Japanese schools. So which are the areas which will hold us back that we might need to get rid of, and which are the areas which are the kind of positive areas that might speed up progress, sort of partnership working and things like that, that we could enhance on, pull on, and kind of really bring our strategy on going forwards. You'll notice that all of these arrows are kind of pointing into a square. So what's going to go into the middle of the square, and the next slide will tell us about that. So really, what would kind of go into the middle bit is how are you actually going to make the strategy work? And all of these things here that you can see aren't actually part of the strategy themselves, but they will help to kind of help you to monitor it. And help you to kind of make sure that it's working going forwards. Of course, we need an implementation plan that will help us to understand how the strategy will be brought into reality, and both strategy is very sort of dependent on an implementation plan, and vice versa. You know, we very much need those things to be talking to each other. Resource plans, of course, very important. And risks, again, incredibly important. We would want to be talking here about sort of strategic risks and organizational risks. Financial risk may be incorporated in there. I would say this, but you might also want to think about impact risks. So what's the biggest risk that might prevent you from bringing about the impact that you want to happen? How high is that potential risk, and what steps you might be able to take to mitigate that? Is it things like low attendance or low understanding of your services or whatever, and kind of trying to come up with a risk mitigation strategy for impact, as well as those other kind of types of risks that I've talked about. And finally, of course, key performance indicators are the things that will tell us about the progress of the strategy and how well we're kind of implementing it, what our kind of journey is like on that trajectory. And ideally, we would want those to kind of feed back into the next stage of the strategy. We'd want the process to be a little bit iterative in that sense. Yeah, so to sort of help you to kind of bring the strategy forwards into kind of a position of more kind of organizational success. So I think Dan is going to talk in the next section, yes, about issues and implications.
Thanks very much. So we've thought in terms of sort of definitions of strategy. We've looked at some of a model of how a strategy could work. What we want to do now for my section, and then carrying on through the questions, is to look at some of the issues and implications of how you create your strategy. We've entitled this webinar, we're looking at what is a good enough strategy? What does a good enough strategy look like? And so, you know, with a title like that, there's an implication that a strategy may not be good enough, or that it may be too good, and you put too much into your strategy. So it's worked very well having a definition and having a model, but the practicalities of making a strategy and making it work, and particularly in changing times as we have at the moment, is more challenging. So I'm going to explore some of those challenges next, and do be thinking of questions that you can ask and discussions that we can have shortly to explore that and make it practical to your own situation. One of the things that Helen talked about was the levers that you can pull on, and in many ways that's sort of thinking about the intersection of the activities that you want to do, the sort of the right hand side of the square and the bottom of the square, the resources, barriers, enablers that you've got, and where those intersect. That helps you to think about what those levers are. And I think really one of the things that sort of we, I suppose, want to emphasize our particular slant on strategy is the importance of impact, the importance of making a difference for our key stakeholders. And we need to be aware of the money, but we need to be aware more of how we use the money and our resources around us in order to create the biggest change possible, the biggest positive change possible for those who really need it. An example, it's a practical example, slightly abstract in some ways, but practical is for me, I'm a trustee of a small charity called Sustainable St Albans. It does kind of what it says on the tin. It's a sustainability organisation trying to encourage the citizens of St Albans district in Hertfordshire to do things which can reduce their carbon footprint. And as a district, we have a disproportionately large carbon footprint in comparison to other districts of a similar size and population density. And so there's a strategic role in Sustainable St Albans trying to make change in our district. But we're small. We're a group of 6 trustees. We don't have any staff. We're a micro charity in many ways. So how do we make a significant impact on a big problem? And we thought about how we can be strategic. What's the lever that we can pull? And one of those levers is our interaction with wider population. People follow us, they come to our events, they engage with what we do. And we can use some of that interaction to, and we did use some of that interaction to get together a petition to encourage the local council to declare a climate emergency. And we got enough people to sign the petition. The council did declare the climate emergency. And so now things are moving forward a lot faster. And we're also able to then to use that lever of the district council in order to make more things happen that we could never achieve ourselves as a small group, by working in partnership with the district council to again use some of our strengths in our community engagement. The wider community listen to us perhaps more than they listen to the council, but we can then take some of the council's aims and objectives for its climate strategy, which we endorse and we've influenced, and spread that out to the wider community in order to create the change that we want to see. So it's thinking about the levers and using those in practical ways to make the biggest change, rather than just focusing on perhaps the smaller things that we could do within our own resources. And that also comes through some thinking from the Stanford Social Innovation Report, which is very much thinking about systems thinking, that we, as all of our charities, we don't act in isolation. We're all dealing with bigger problems than we can just deal with on our own, and we need to find ways to collaborate in order to create the societal change that we want to see happen. So that was thinking about strategies, but what does a good enough strategy look like? So here I think are sort of 5 things that that we think you really need to stick to. The first one comes back to where Mark started. It's about knowing where you want to go to, and the important verb I think in that first bullet is about agreement, agreeing. If as an organization you don't all agree where you're going to go, then your strategy won't be good enough. If you remember the triangle that Mark showed earlier with lots of arrows in it going in all sorts of different directions, that's kind of not where you want to be as a charity. You want to be the triangle with everybody going in the same direction towards your strategic goal. Important to focus on strategy before settling into tactics. The tactics are important, but as Helen was saying, some of those plans and some of them, so things you do need to have those, but you need to have your strategy first so that they inform what your implementation plan, your risk analysis is. Don't get too hung up on the process of strategy creation. Back to Mark's point about you could be prescriptive, you could be loose. It depends what's important for you as an organization and for where your strategy is going. Don't get too hung up on the process. The important thing is to get a strategy out of it at the end. And too many charities spend years pondering their strategies and maybe not really achieving very much. Those 4 things: impact, stakeholders, activity, and resources. Those are the 4 parts of the square that Helen took us around. Don't forget those and treat them with equal measure, so that you can then use the best levers to make the best change for your key stakeholders. So that's the good side of things. That's what a good enough strategy looks like. We're just going to touch on the issues and some of the implications. So some of the issues that sort of come out of maybe not having a good enough strategy. Does your organization sound like some of these scenarios? And some of these insights have come from Harvard Business Review last year. There's a link there which you'll have when you get the presentation. You can look at that in full. And then we've added to those to some other things which we think are important. But, the first one in your organization is everybody on the same page. And now there will always be somebody who isn't on the same page, but really you kind of need to get most people to be on the same page, or at least in the same book and roughly the same chapter. So if that's not happening, why isn't that happening? Is it because there's leadership issues? Is it because your strategy is not clear enough? Well, it's probably the strategy is not clear enough, and that then creates the leadership issues, because some of those leadership issues may be that your senior leadership is too operational. It doesn't focus on the strategy, just get straight to the nitty-gritty, but doesn't really have the big picture to inform what that nitty-gritty should be. If your leaders aren't really equipped to deal with strategy, then that's an issue that needs to be sorted out. They need to take that big picture view so that others in the organization can be more operational. But their leadership might be strategic, but they may have a disconnect between their staff teams and not really communicating downwards what the strategy is. Leadership is going in one direction, the rest of the organization is wondering where they're going because they're not hearing anything, they're not getting the messages, they're not really connecting with your leadership. You may be working in silos. That's something which isn't uncommon in charities, either in different departments working for different beneficiaries, or even within departments, you may have different fiefdoms, different silos. Everybody's working to their own strategy, not working across the organization, not engaging with where the organization really wants to go and with the change that it wants to create. And so those are four very obvious things which you can notice in an organization, but they're all killers when it comes to trying to make your strategy happen. And there's an expression that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and it's quite a good image to get through. And those first four are really about, or they sort of demonstrate how your culture could go wrong. And you may have a wonderful strategy, but if you can't get your culture right, and the strategy can't inform that culture, then you're not doing well. Then these last two are really important as well. That not maximizing or measuring impact. So losing focus of that first point, the first bit of the square that Helen took us around. If you don't really try to maximize your impact, and if you're not measuring it, then you won't find the best strategic direction. And I'm a firm believer that if you don't measure things, then nobody really takes them seriously. If you do measure them, then people worry about whether they're achieving those measurements and getting it right, and people will be working towards the things that you measure. So don't put in measurements that measure things that aren't really important, aren't really necessary, but do put in measurements that will measure the key impacts that you want to take in order to achieve the strategy that you've all agreed on and that you believe is the right way to go ahead. And then lastly, and it's in bold because it's really important, not really understanding how the resources that you've got align with the impact that you want to create. It's in that scenario, it's not using your biggest levers to create biggest change. It's not even knowing where the levers are. So you need to understand what those levers are. You need to think through your resources and how those work to create the impact that you want. And understanding your impact is critical to that, and being able to measure it and being able to have some results to know whether you're achieving the impact that you want to achieve is obviously key to that. But also understanding what your resources are, knowing the barriers and the enablers within that, and making sure that you're making use of those enablers and you're mitigating against the barriers. Otherwise, you're not going to create the impact that you want, and your strategic direction will be woeful. So lastly, some of those implications that I was sort of alluding to, which will help you to survive or to evolve. Mark's smiling there because he knows I've worked hard on the alliteration for these 4 points. So I'm going to mention that because I'm proud of it. So the first one, muddled models. So that's where, as I was sort of saying, you don't know what your best levers are. Maybe you don't even know what any of your levers are to maximize the change that you want to do. You're just muddling along, doing the things that you've always done, hoping that it will work. That's not going to be that's not going to help you evolve. It probably won't even help you survive. That is a serious implication of having a not good enough strategy. The next bit, systemic stagnation, is sort of picking up on the point that decision making is critical within strategy. So agreeing things, but also knowing how to make decisions in the future to move forward. And if you don't have a good decision making process and you don't have ways of agreeing things, then ultimately you're stagnate as an organization, and that will have a real negative impact on your beneficiaries, on your stakeholders. Next, funding failures. Another sort of key stakeholder is your funder, and if they don't really believe what you're doing because your strategy isn't really good enough, it's not live enough, then you're not going to interest them, you're not going to engage with them, they're not going to want to continue to fund you. You do need to keep your strategy, make sure that it is good enough so that it inspires your donors, whether they're individuals or institutions, to keep putting money, to keep investing in your cause, because they believe that you can create the change that they want to see in the service users that they're interested in. And then the last point around people, and Mark talked about the importance of people in their sort of prescriptive list of things for creating a strategy. Yeah, if you don't really have a strategy, then your best people leave, and the others, who by definition aren't the best, stay. And you want to keep some of your best people, and you maybe want some of the others to move on. So have a good strategy which will help you to do that. Obviously, you do want some good people to leave, because that also shows that you're a healthy organization, nurturing talented people who will then go on and create change elsewhere, and maybe continue your organization's mission, but within a different organization. That's good, generous leadership. But you want some of your best people to stick with you as well. So very lastly, why it all matters. Where there is no vision, the people perish. Some people may recognize that quote. It's been around a long time. It's a biblical proverb, but I think it's very true for today, particularly in these sort of COVID times. Strategies are about knowing your destination and how you're going to get there. So really, keep that to heart. Without that shared strategy, it's hard enough to thrive, let alone survive. So we all want to survive. In fact, as Mark was saying, 50% of organizations coming to us and looking to how they can evolve, how they can take what they've learned from COVID and move forwards. Without getting your strategy right, you're struggling even to thrive. And the reason that you do it is because of the stakeholders that we're all here for. We owe it to them to be strategic, not to just muddle along. We owe it to them to make things better for their lives and their futures. So the real important thing is that we do work hard to create a good enough strategy, and to know where we're going, and to make sure that we're going to get there. So our question to you, to start off the questions, is what stops you having a good enough strategy? So we're going to now move into open questions. So hopefully there's a few things in the chat, but feel free to put things into the Q&A as well, and let's have a bit of discussion for the last 20 minutes or so on how you're doing with your strategies and what makes a good one. So I will stop sharing so that we can do that, and then we can all have a chat around what we've got there. So where we want to start, Mark and Helen.
I was just going to have a. Sorry, go Helen, please.
I was going to say it looks like maybe people are kind of taking a moment to digest or something, and I think your kind of question was really interesting. So yeah, what is stopping you from, what's your barrier to gaining a good enough strategy? And maybe while people are gathering their thoughts, I might be able to take advantage of this situation to put Mark and Dan on the spot and ask, have you seen any kind of really good examples of strategy? Can you think of any kind of strategic role models in the sector that we might be able to kind of aim at? I think a lot of strategy conversations tend to be quite diffuse and quite airy, and it would be interesting to see if we can kind of think of something in particular, something a bit more concrete that we might be able to aim for. I would kind of struggle with answering that one, which is why I'm asking the both of you, but I don't know, would either of you have anything to say on that matter?
Well, I'm happy to go. Do you want to go first, Dan? And then I'm happy to, or shall I go first? What do you reckon?
Go on, you go first if you've got something.
Oh, I was going to say, I put something in I put a word in the chat there. Big, hairy, audacious goals, yeah, BHAGs. And it's kind of interesting that the US has started to really focus on this word BHAGs, yeah. Now, I love WaterAid. I absolutely adore WaterAid. But WaterAid said that when they actually achieved a certain level of, if you like, sort of water and sanitation across low-income countries, in other words, the Millennium Development Goals, yeah, they would stop, they would finish, yeah, and that would be the end of their work. And then suddenly they reinvented themselves as focusing on the Millennium Development Goals and taking forward their work in a more profound way, yeah. So in terms of strategy, I would just point to WaterAid. I just think that they're really smart. I think their alignment with Blue Water is really cool. I think some of the stuff they do, for example, with I don't know, water and sanitation, and you know, getting involved in the space where you've got governments that won't legitimize, where you've got corporates that won't take the risk, and where NGOs are just too small, they galvanize people to step into that space. And so I just have a soft spot. I have a soft spot for WaterAid.
It's a very good answer. Dan,
Yeah.
do you have anything? We
So,
have a few more questions
yeah,
coming
they're
through, actually.
piling in now, aren't they?
Yeah.
I guess a couple of thoughts. So one is sort of some charities take the brave strategy of getting smaller rather than getting bigger, and I think Sense is one that's done that fairly recently, and I think that is a brave thing to do, and there are good reasons. It's a sensible thing to do, but it's not an easy thing to do, because we're all sort of accustomed to the idea that the growth is what we have to do. We have to get more to do more things, reach more people, raise more funds, but all of that. And actually, biggest isn't always best in terms of creating the most impact, and sometimes being too big can actually stop you from creating the impact that you want to create. And then I guess this is an example that I know from personal experience. I'm a trustee of another organisation called Rethink Mental Illness. We're a mid-sized English charity working with people who are affected by severe mental illness. And most of the work that we do at Rethink is commissioned through different NHS and statutory bodies. And there's a growing chunk of fundraising which augments that as well. But it was partly before COVID hit, but particularly when COVID hit, we took the strategic decision, I think, to change tack in some of the things that we do. Instead of running a lot of our own work, which was directly commissioned by organisations like different NHS mental health trusts and others, we saw that there was an opportunity to get some funding and to work at a place-based level rather than just on a specific service level. And we started some work in the county of Somerset to basically work not just with Rethink, but work with a whole bunch of other smaller organisations that were in the voluntary sector that were delivering services within Somerset in order to just improve the ecosystem for mental health delivery. And it was funded by the NHS Trust that was responsible for the whole of Somerset. But what we had to do with that was we received a chunk of funding, but we were also giving out a chunk of funding to other organisations, and working to ensure that all of the ones that we were working with got a chance to do more than they could have done otherwise. And we had to provide what we term generous leadership. I think in terms of that, we weren't able to take all of the money. We decided not to take all of the money and to pass it on to others, and to create a bigger pie than we would have done just by running Rethink services in Somerset. And I think that strategic direction is now one that's growing, and other NHS bodies are seeing it and wanting to replicate the same thing where they are around the country, and it's becoming a model for really strong sort of community-based mental health services all across the piece. So that I think is a good example of some of that systems thinking that I talked about earlier as well, which is a good way forwards.
It's interesting that both answers are about collaboration and understanding your role within the wider ecosystem and within those systems. That's really interesting. We've got a few questions that have come through now, haven't we?
Yeah, shall I pick up the first one, which is, I apologize as I joined 10 minutes late. Yep. No problem at all. You're most welcome. Did you have a template for strategy? Yep. We talked about the one-page strategy. Go back into the slides. The slides will be sent out afterwards. Have a look there. Yeah. Carl, how does the panel feel about starting afresh or review whatever strategy was in place before COVID and try to apply the thoughts of the presentation to the existing strategy? I mean, I'll just answer, very quickly on that. The one-page strategy, you can take the stuff that you've already got and just slap it against the one-page strategy and see what sticks. So, for example, if you're happy, for example, with your outcomes and what you're doing, great, hold on to those. If they need to be adapted around activities, focus your efforts on that. If you know your stakeholders and they haven't changed, fine, slap that in place, yeah. And you can see you can build this canvas quite easily by taking what you've already got, yeah. So I wouldn't start afresh. I would not start afresh. I'd just take what you've already got and start to put it around the canvas and then see, for example, this bit here with volunteers isn't working any longer. How are we going to focus on volunteers? The only other thought I'd say is back to sigmoid curves, back to Handy. If you are realizing through your discussions that you're coming to the end of your life and your maturity has reached its peak and it's going to start to laggard, it's going to start to go down, address it, reimagine. Carl, I hope that helps. Yeah. What about you, Helen? What about Dan? Any comments on that, or should we go on to another question?
I think one thing we haven't really talked about is where time fits into this, and time scales. That's sort of there with the sigmoid curve that you're referring to, Mark. But different organisations will have different time frames that their strategies should work within. We're in. The impact of COVID has made all of us much more short term in our planning and our thinking, because we sometimes we don't even know what's going to happen next month, let alone in 2 years' time, because so much could potentially change. But other organisations will have a longer time frame on things. The issues that they're trying to address are bigger, and coming back to the climate change stuff for sustainable St Albans, we're looking at what can we do now, but how does that have an impact in 2030? How does that have an impact in 2050? Those are sort of two of the key markers that are out there. So when you're thinking about revising your strategies, Carl, some of the things that you were aiming for still are very, very important, because they're things which maybe you weren't expecting to hit for quite some time anyway. So how you're going to get there will shift, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of some of that longer term vision that is still very valid.
So I've got a lovely chance to get back at you, Helen, by picking a question from here and just saying, so Simon Rollison's question, yeah, I think is great. If the levers you've got don't match the impact you want, which would you prioritize, yeah? And how would you go about finding new ones?
So I think for me, it always comes back to the impact, and that's the really, really crucial thing, is focusing on what's the impact that you need to create as an organization. One thing that comes a little bit back to the point that Dan's just touched on is we do have a few different kind of timescales involved here. So there may be some kind of short-term things, there may be some levers that you might be able to do in a shorter term, but ultimately you want to be moving towards a point where you are seeking for that kind of the major impact that you want to create, and kind of trying to create levers in that space. One thing I think that's come up in the discussion that we've already touched on is that partnerships and understanding the ecosystem within which you're working is a really kind of fruitful and rich source for kind of levers and thinking about pulling on those different areas. So one suggestion from my perspective would be to do maybe a more kind of in-depth look at the ecosystem or the system within which you're operating in, and thinking about those really kind of interesting partnerships or interesting areas of overlap. If the lever doesn't exist at the moment, but you know what the impact is that you want to create, you're over halfway there, and it's a matter of looking for those really kind of interesting touch points that you might be able to kind of use in order to partnership with other organizations. So that's one area that I might start in. I don't know what you think, Dan and Mark.
I guess that maybe another part of the question there is also around does the impact that you want, is that the right impact if your levers are pointing in a different direction, rather than trying to find new levers, do you need to rethink impact or the things that you're trying to change? It's difficult. You need to make sure that the tail doesn't wag the dog with some of this, that you're not chasing things because they're there, rather than chasing things because they're the right thing to do. But it is maybe a chance to revisit the impact that you want to create as well.
I was going to take us off in a completely different direction, Helen. Yeah, which is around actually, if you as a charity have resources, but you're not really creating impact, sometimes it's the right thing to find a merger or like sort of find a different way of doing things. Maybe it's better to actually take your money and put it in another organization that can actually help you in a different way. So I think fundamentally differently. I mean, this reimagine piece shouldn't see the long-term survival of your organization at all costs. If it creates more impact by actually using your resources in a totally different way, for example, giving them to somebody else, that might be the best strategic option you've got. So I think, Simon, it's really interesting at the moment, because I'm seeing short-term tactical strategies and long-term strategies, and people are really playing with timescales, as Dan says. I think it's a really interesting time, Simon. I really do. Hopefully, Helen, that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got another one here from Anthony Strachan as well, who's asked, how do you suggest that an organisation can reach a good strategy whilst opportunities to meet physically are limited? Which is a really good question. And again, one of the themes of the presentation was trying to get everyone on the same kind of page, or at least in the same chapter, as Dan said, even if everyone's not on the same page. And consultation throughout the strategy process is really, really important. And people in your organizations are experts on their different things. And, the people at the coalface will know very different things to the people who manage the databases, the people who are in charge of the valuation data. So I think collaboration is of course, very, very important. One thing that I would say in terms of kind of my journey over the last 18 months or so, Anthony, is if you're kind of working in a space where there are lots of people who are able to get online, there's amazing possibility of kind of wealth of free resources to really get people involved. And one thing that's made me really, really excited actually over the last 18 months is this idea of digital participation, digital kind of consultation, participatory democracy kind of processes and things like that, because there has just been this absolute explosion of kind of online resources and tools for people to use. So there's things like Mural, there's Zoom. We've been running kind of lots of focus groups in our impact work, which you can put people into breakout rooms, you can mix people up, you can do all sorts of things, get people to answer polls, put their answers in a word cloud to understand, to sort of do a PESTLE analysis or a SWOT analysis or whatever. So there's lots and lots of different ideas out there. I think obviously one thing that always should be mentioned in these conversations is that not everyone is online, and digital exclusion is a whole other matter. And hopefully kind of as we kind of move into a world which is a little bit easier, maybe we will also kind of start using the more traditional methods as well. But what I would say is you should definitely try and investigate starting off that strategy process by using kind of some of those things that I've mentioned. And if you'd like any kind of references, then do feel free to get in touch. I'm very happy to have a conversation with you about the kind of resources that I know of. Mark or Dan, do you have anything to kind of add?
I've got a very quick
some experience.
Yeah, I've got a very quick thing to add, because Dan, you're just about to do some work with BHIVA, BHIVA, which is the British HIV Association, and they've decided that they're going to run a hybrid event. So they're going to get those people physically together to have the energy. And they're going to also have like an online digital event. And then what they're going to do is bring those two groups together. So Dan, are you worried about doing that? I mean, it's a strategy session. So are you worried about it, or how you feel?
I hope the technology will work, but I think it should do. Yeah, we'll have some people in the room, some people on screens in another room, and then on a screen in another room. And on occasions we'll have some people on the screen and others in the room, and we'll be talking to everybody all at the same time. I think it will work quite well. I mean, having people on screens means that small group work is quite easy to do. We've all found ways to sort of do the Zoom room sort of thing. The whole group stuff will be more interesting, but I think it just needs to be facilitated well, and that hopefully we'll be able to achieve that when we do it. And so in some ways that brings us on to Carl's question, which is, how do you gain commitment from a small board to do the strategic thinking, and not simply attend meetings to hear how you've done since the last meeting and what will go on before the next one. So you are right, Carl, you have to have the right people on the board, and if you maybe don't have the right people on board, then that's because they're not asking the strategic questions. But and another slightly flippant response is invite us along. It's the sort of thing that we do. We might be able to help you with that. And a quick plug for those who are listening, we are doing a training session on the 15th of July around strategy and survival or evolution, and bringing out some of the things that we've talked about today, but in more detail. So if you're interested in that, the email will come out, and that will be one way to pick up a bit more information, and also to talk with other charity people from different charities in the small groups that we'll have on that training session. But I suppose another thought sort of picks up on what Helen was saying just a minute ago, Carl, around that stakeholder in engagement. It is really about asking the right questions to get people to be involved, to put their thoughts into it, rather than just being passive and just receiving information. By asking questions, by asking open questions, by getting debate, by getting discussion, even disagreements. Sometimes disagreements are actually helpful in order to come to a resolution. And if everybody all agrees with everything all of the time, then there's going to be very little creativity going on. So you need a little bit of friction, a little bit of disagreement to be creative in how you come up with your strategies at the end. But maybe those are some thoughts to help you to move on, but possibly bring somebody else onto the board who's a disruptor and get things going.
So I don't think we can go very much further, Helen. I was going to say, I think we're kind of done in terms of time. So I just want to respect people's time.
Yes,
I mean, Anthony, do you advocate having an external communicator, facilitator to keep the process grounded? I think in a lot of cases it can work very, very well, and also ask big questions. The right type of questions to move forward. Shall I wrap up, Helen, or Dan? Do you want to have the last word? Thank you. Disruptor idea is good, from Carl Richardson. So just from myself, I mean, it's back to the painting. I much prefer to have the painting and to have everybody aligned, and kind of this vision and this ambition of what we're going to achieve. And back to that great question that's just been asked, what's the ambition we have? I don't want to change 100 people's lives. I want to change 100,000 people's lives. And sometimes by being audacious, setting those big, hairy, audacious goals for all of us, it can really make us think differently about how we're going to achieve that strategy. Cool. Join us on the 15th for the strategy session. I think that's all I've got to say. And thank you, audience, for staying with us. I can see you've diligently stayed with us, and we will see you on.
And we'll put out some of these resources and links in the follow-up email. So those who wanted those, it will come.
Okay, bye-bye. Be good, everybody. And if you come up with a theme tune, that would be absolutely fantastic. You can come up with whatever theme tune you want. The A theme I just think is awesome.